Hi, this is Dr. Chin, and this is the lecture on Chapter 12, which will be on portfolios. So the chapter is divided into 5 parts. So first we'll talk about what portfolios are. Then we'll discuss the characteristics of a good portfolio, the advantages and disadvantages. And then we'll talk about some of the considerations to take into account when making a portfolio or deciding if you should do a portfolio. And then the sort of like the general purpose as to why we do portfolios in the first place. And then there's a special section on populations with special needs and about how portfolios a lot of times can be a pretty good way of assessing the progress and outcomes of students with diverse needs. So tests such as true false tests, essay questions, multiple choice items, all those items that we discussed in previous chapters, they're they're not necessarily always the best way to evaluate an individual's performance. A relatively new way to assess outcomes, especially outcomes that don't necessarily lend themselves to the more traditional form of assessments, would be portfolios. And so, historically, if you go back in time, portfolios have mostly been used in the arts, music, dance, other types of creative activity disciplines. However, this is changing as this tool is becoming more popular in fields such as education, social work, and other clinical areas of understanding human behavior. The purpose of this chapter is to give you a good introduction to what portfolios are, how they're used, and how they can be beneficial for both the teacher, the students, and other relevant stakeholders. So, what is a portfolio? Well, and this is important for you to know for the exam, especially for that. A portfolio is essentially a collection of work that shows the efforts, progress, and accomplishments in one or more areas. So, for example, for a chemistry class portfolio, you could have various materials in there that are testament to the efforts, the progress, and the accomplishments of a student as he or she makes their way through a chemistry class. So, you could include things such as the lab manual, the plan for experiments, the results, the data, ideas about future research, the lab reports that were generated. Basically, what you're doing is you're trying to paint a picture of what are the various dimensions of this course, of this content area that that were explored, that were practiced, that were learned during the course of a particular class. So it's like a very structured, intentionally arranged collage of materials that represent the not just the learning outcomes, but the process of learning for this individual person. Um, this is another example of a portfolio, say a portfolio for a creative writing type of class. So you could include in there the student poetry, journals, essays, impressions of other students' works. Um, and it will probably the sequence and the way in which you would arrange these documents is going to be dependent on what exactly you would want your student to showcase, to demonstrate. Maybe the focus could be more on outcomes. Maybe the focus is more on growth. A lot of times, in my experience, when I've seen people use portfolios, it is to document the individual growth of the student throughout the process of learning a particular content area. Um, so, what makes a good portfolio? There are 4 characteristics of a good portfolio, and it's listed over here. And in the next 4 slides, we'll look into each of these characteristics in a little bit more detail. So, let's first of all talk about how a good portfolio is both formative and summative in nature. So, what does this mean? Um, a good portfolio that is both formative and summative means that the evaluation is continuous. The efforts and the accomplishments that are evaluated in the portfolio could be created, say, every 3 weeks or every 4 lessons. Basically, you would collect these data in a longitudinal sense, and then at various times during the course. And the idea is that you get various time points that could then represent the direction and the momentum of growth that this particular student may be experiencing throughout the course. So it's formative in that sense because it's giving you an idea about what is the growth trajectory, what is the student learning at various stages of various phases of this course. The summative part is typically the final evaluation, and this could be in the form of a integrated reflection paper where the student is talking about, based on all these things that I've included in my portfolio, the logical conclusion as to what the take-home message as to what I've been learning is, and the student will kind of fill in the blank. So a good portfolio really is a combination of formative indices as well as summative indices that paints a really comprehensive picture of this student's educational trajectory. All right, so the second characteristic of a good portfolio is that it is a product that reflects the multi-dimensional nature of both the task and the content area. So, for example, say we have an art student who's applying to a college level art school, and he or she has to assemble a portfolio that reflects his or her interests and abilities. Probably what the student would want to do is that he or she would want to think pretty broadly in creating that portfolio and include lots of different types of media in the case of this art student. So you want to include maybe drawings, clay creations, paintings. Basically, don't limit the content to one category only. You want this to be an opportunity for a student to be both expressive and to also be able to think differently and big in terms of the scope of ideas that are being covered over here. So that's the nice thing about a portfolio. It is arguably it gives a more in-depth picture about how much did this person learn, and in regards to what are the different facets of the knowledge subject that this person has been learning. So that's the second characteristic of a good portfolio. Not just that it is formative and summative in nature, but it also reflects the multidimensional nature of learning for this student. The third characteristic of a good portfolio is that it allows the student to participate directly in their own growth and learning. So maybe while being closely monitored by a teacher or a supervisor, the student can participate with feedback in the process of creating each element and gets to think and consider about the direction in which his or her work is going and what adjustments need to be made. This is pretty cool because it is a dynamic type of assessment, um, where it allows the student to intentionally think about where they've come from, where they are right now, and where they will want to go from here. There's been studies that have shown that repeated assessments with good feedback, with constructive feedback, facilitates learning. There's also this idea that's frequently discussed in research circles about assessment reactivity. And assessment reactivity is basically the idea that, if you give people feedback about how they're doing at a particular time point, they just naturally want to take steps to change or to grow, just simply by looking at themselves. Because a lot of times I think people don't push themselves is because they're not necessarily being presented with the feedback that they would need to know to figure out where they've come from, where they are right now, and where they would want to go from here. So, in other words, by using a portfolio, the student gets a chance to participate directly in the evaluation process both by deciding what to include in the portfolio and by also getting feedback from the teacher. So it's a give and take kind of thing. So the student and his or her contribution becomes indispensable to this process of determining what is the future direction that this work is going to go in. So that's the third characteristic of a good portfolio. It allows the student to participate in their own growth and learning. And finally, the fourth characteristic of a good portfolio is that it allows teachers to become increasingly involved in the process of designing and implementing a curriculum. In many or in some educational settings, teachers are often told what they need to teach and even how. With the use of portfolios, you kind of empower the teacher to decide what is going to go into their everyday activities, because the products of those everyday activities is going to be integrated into this portfolio. And so this encourages the teacher to think creatively about the specific activities that they're doing regularly, and how that's going to go well together with the types of assessments that the teacher would want to do to assess the progress of the students. And so not just being portfolios are nice, not just because they encourage further involvement of the student in the assessment process, but it also encourages the teacher to think more deeply about the integration between classroom activities and the assessment materials that are being used to track the progress of students. So those are the four characteristics of a good portfolio. It is both formative and summative in nature. It allows the student to reflect the multidimensional nature of their learning capacity. It allows the student to participate in their own growth and learning, and it encourages the teacher to be especially intentional in deciding what are the specific activities that they would want to implement in class, given that it's going to be integrated well with the assessment materials. Now let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of using portfolios. There are 4 advantages of using portfolios and 3 disadvantages of using portfolios. Let's talk about each of them a little bit. So, number 1. So, as a means of assessment, portfolios are clearly very different from traditional methods of achievement tests, which typically when it comes to traditional methods of achievement tests, the methods examines one's knowledge, circumscribed knowledge in a particular area. So, and this is important for you to know for the exam too. So, while a traditional achievement test is more or less bound by time and content, a portfolio allows the student and teacher to expand the format of the material that is being evaluated. This is testament to the flexibility that is inherent in using portfolios, because the uses are wide open and really limited only by the creativity of the person assigning and administering the assessment. So portfolios are really flexible, and it gives plenty of ways for the teacher and student to both decide how to use this. Now, second, portfolios are highly personalized for both the student and teacher. This allows the student to truly get their quote unquote voice out there in expressing what they have learned in a particular course. This is particularly beneficial for students who don't typically do well in traditional testing situations for whatever the reason that might be. It could be test anxiety, it could be a lack of familiarity with the usual types of assessment methods that are done in the school, especially if you're teaching non-traditional students or students who don't have a whole lot of background in, say, higher education or formal education per se. Third, portfolios are an attractive alternative to traditional methods of assessments. This is especially for providing case study information for teachers, instructors who want to showcase maybe the scope of learning to other educators who may want to replicate their courses. And so if you're a teacher and you're going to, let's say, a teacher conference that is all about teaching strategies, a lot of times the materials that you can get from these portfolios, especially the formative and summative evaluations, it really does a nice job of painting a picture to convey to other educators about what did you actually do and what were the specific products that came out of the classroom as a result of that. So that's why portfolios are an attractive alternative. Fourth, portfolios are a creative method of assessment, especially when other tools are too limiting or inappropriate. So think about disciplines where, such as creative or performing arts disciplines, trying to evaluate the skills of an actor or singer or dancer solely through an essay question or a multiple choice question or a true false question. If those were the only tools that you had to measure their learning, in these disciplines, that would probably be too limiting or inappropriate. So, portfolios do really well, especially for those creative or artsy types of disciplines. Now, so portfolios clearly have disadvantages as well. Um, one of the price of using portfolios is that the effort that you need to create a portfolio and the effort needed to evaluate a portfolio, I mean, they both take a really long time, really, to fairly judge each element in the portfolio. So they can be pretty time consuming to evaluate. This is especially relevant if you're teaching a really large class. So say you've become an instructor in a college and you have to say lecture or teach a class that has like 100 students. Assigning portfolios to every single student is not going to be sustainable. So you kind of had to think about what could be other possible ways to make this sustainable, or think about other tools that you can use to measure learning. So they're time consuming, essentially. That's what I'm trying to say. The second disadvantage is that portfolios don't really cover all subjects equally well, nor can they be used for all curriculum types. Um, and so that's just something to keep in mind. As neat as the idea of portfolios are, they don't necessarily lend themselves pretty well to all types of curriculum types. Um, Thirdly, the third disadvantage is that the evaluation can be pretty subjective, which is one of the major criticisms of portfolios. But for topics where subjectivity may seem to be less important, portfolios may very well allow for more artistic expression and be more user friendly for those types of topics. Um, in addition, especially if you're applying portfolios to fields whereby objectivity is a lot more um, prized and emphasized on, you can define or operationalize to some degree the objectives or the content in which that you're going to grade. So you can make like a grading rubric, for example, so that the student kind of knows what to expect. So instead of just saying, this is going to be a subjective type of judgment, make a table that represents the main things that you're probably going to be looking at, and what are some of the anchor points that can help describe uh, whether or not you get an A, B, C, or D in a particular content area that you're going to be grading. So it's still not going to be as objective as compared to counting the number of questions that you got correct in a multiple choice question, but there are some ways to help operationalize the objectives so that at least the students and the instructors are going to be on the same page in regards to expectations. So, at its most basic form, a portfolio really is an opportunity to collect work, to organize it, and to basically show it off. And keep in mind, and this is important for the exam too, that in when collecting and organizing material, that there are essentially two fundamental dimensions that must be considered when using portfolio. So first is the content, and second is the age or developmental level of the student. So let's talk about each in the next two slides. So the content of the portfolio. So the content of the portfolio usually reflects the class assignments that are key to the particular curriculum that is being studied. So if the lesson, for example, is on the reliability of achievement tests, then maybe one entry in the student's portfolio would be a journal article uh, that kind of summarizes the reliability of an achievement test. Um, it could be a summary of, say, the student's thought process on the types of reliabilities that he or she thinks would be most relevant or appropriate for this particular achievement test. Or maybe if if we're dealing with a student studying creative writing, maybe a portfolio entry might be a biography of a writer that the student feels has influenced his or her work. The content can be from several areas, so long as they're all related to the curriculum of interest. So kind of keep in mind the boundaries in which what you're trying to assess over here, even though you can be pretty creative on how you achieve some of your assessment objectives. Now, in addition to thinking about the content of what you're trying to cover, the age, grade, or developmental level of the student speaks to the way in which the portfolio is created and used by the teacher too. So, for example, for a first grader who's just beginning the reading process, perhaps oral reports for simple books that have been read over maybe, I don't know, a week or 2 week period, that would be sufficient, and the reports can be recorded and included in this portfolio. But maybe for a junior high student, we're looking for something a little bit more substantive, such as a 2 or 3 page book review plus a peer evaluation of an oral report, which would reflect well on the student's ability to comprehend and then synthesize ideas to put forth. So it's really important for you as a teacher to take into consideration the age, the developmental level of the students that you are working with. You want to stretch them, but you also don't want to make it an impossible task, given the developmental phase of where your students might be in their educational trajectory. And finally, there is the purpose for which portfolios will be used. So there are three purposes that I want to briefly mention. So we already know that portfolios can serve students pretty well in that they allow students to track his or her own work, get feedback, and then incorporate that feedback into the body of work that is represented in the portfolio. So, in other words, and this is important for you to note, portfolios allow students to participate in their own growth and learning, such that the students can provide feedback to not just themselves, but to their teachers. So, it's a joint effort to improve student learning as they run along. The second purpose of portfolio is that it allows the teacher to make really rich and detailed comparisons, maybe across students, across classrooms, or maybe even schools. And again, this is so that maybe the teacher is interested in disseminating whatever pedagogy or teaching method that they're using in the class, and you want to show other educators on how this can be done. A lot of times, seeing the products and the formative and summative evaluations, those things do a really nice job of telling other educators on what did you do and what were some of the things that came out of your class as a result of your techniques. The third purpose of portfolios, and this is obviously for younger populations, is that you can also get the parents involved in the process of learning. This also helps the parent and teacher to calibrate or adjust their expectations. It helps the parents and teachers to be on the same page as they're both tracking the progress of that particular student. And so, just especially for younger kids, having parents and teachers be on the same page does wonders in terms of facilitating the learning for that student. Now, the flexibility, and this is the last topic in this chapter, the flexibility of portfolios lends itself really nicely for use with populations with diverse needs or populations with special needs. So, for example, an article in 2006 that was cited in your textbook discussed about how using electronic portfolios can help students' efforts to advocate for themselves. Um, by basically developing their own self advocacy and self determination skills. Self advocacy and self determination skills, these are two very important sets of skills for success later in life. And portfolios is a really nice way for students to learn how to decide how they can be their best advocate, to maybe talk about their skills, to talk about their knowledge. And this is going to be especially relevant when you're going to try to find a job in the future, right? You kind of have to be your own self advocacy to some extent. Um, the authors also argued that by helping plan and present the portfolio, the student can make it very clear what are his not just strengths but also limitations, as well as plans on how to move forward. So this is a really nice way, especially for dealing with a group of students who may be discouraged for whatever reason in class. It could be because they're not used to the traditional means of assessment, and this could be one way for them um, to demonstrate what did they learn, and how this is going to shape where they would want to go from here. So it kind of empowers students to take more control, to take more ownership of their educational experience, as opposed to just leaning on the teacher solely to learn. Now, other educators involved with disabled or children with disabilities are also using portfolios in creative ways. There are some considerations to keep in mind for using portfolios with populations with diverse needs. So, first of all, um, as it is, there is quite a bit of variability in any groups of students, but in groups with disabilities, there's likely to be higher variabilities in terms of what they can or cannot do, what their strengths and weaknesses. So this means even more individualization and specialization as far as the strategies and using in portfolios. And your creativity is going to be most useful in regards to how to best use portfolios to foster the learning progress for your students. Second, the Salkind talks about the possible use of adaptive devices such as alternate forms of presentations, assistive devices, extended time limits. Give your students multiple ways, and that's essentially the spirit behind portfolios, where your students have multiple options to choose from how they can demonstrate their learning. And third, not just you and other personnel who may be involved in the delivery of education in whatever institution that you might end up in, should probably be educated as well, and that uses a portfolio with populations with special needs versus populations without special needs. Um, and so these are just some considerations to take into account. The first one is gonna be the most important. Just knowing ahead of time that going into this, you should expect to see some individualization and creativity that you are going to creating these portfolios. So, what's clearly working on the assessment front is that there are many different ways to evaluate behavior in portfolios when you use it correctly and creatively. So, portfolios can be a really major tool at the end of the day. It's important to remember that a good portfolio is not just a collection of an individual's work. It is a systematically organized and documented group of elements and goals that meet predefined objectives. And so there is some structure to this, there is some logic to this, but at the same time, there's also enough space for creativity to come into the picture. So are portfolios meant for every teacher or trainer or student or trainee in every setting? Probably not. But do portfolios provide an alternative for the assessment of certain topics where traditional methods of objective measurements might fall short? Absolutely. We just talked about the different fields or disciplines where all of the other traditional forms of assessments kind of fall short. Portfolios are really flexible, um, and really useful, and can be really effective if used correctly, taking into account all of the suggestions that we had talked about in this chapter on best practices. So that's pretty much it on this chapter for on portfolios. So we talked about what portfolios are. We talked about the characteristics of a good portfolio, and there were four to be exact. Then we talked about some of the advantages and disadvantages, some considerations to take into account, the purpose of doing portfolios, and some considerations when using portfolios with special needs or diverse needs. So that's all for the lecture for this chapter. Um, for your third quarterly assignment, I think you'll basically be talking about how portfolios may or may not be suitable for specific students or specific classrooms. Take a look at it. It should be pretty interesting. If you have a good sense of what portfolios are for and what you can or cannot achieve with portfolios, you should be able to answer those questions pretty well. It helps. The third quarterly assignment will do a nice job of helping you think a little bit deeper about when you should use portfolios and when you probably shouldn't use portfolios. That's all I have for you today. Have a good rest of the day, evening, or afternoon, whatever time it might be.